The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss Father Robert Spitzer's Science and the Doorstep of God. This is something worth discussing. It's not an easy read, but he's a good teacher. He organizes things very well. He repeats himself, and he shows how things connect. Giving kind of an overview of this, where we are, the title is Science, the Doorstep of God. What does he mean by science? Well, he's taking physics especially. That's the main hard science he's taking. He's also taking psychology or sociology or medicine with scientific reports on various phenomena of people. And then he's also taking the science of philosophy, which is not what we consider physical science, but it's still a mode of knowledge. And he's showing how the evidence from these three areas, which are distinct areas, very distinct areas, all point to the same conclusion. That is, there must be some being behind it all, causing it all. And so the first chapter, which we've already discussed, was it's a short chapter. Does science point to a beginning of our universe? And that was based on physical sciences, with the best scientific theories being that there was a Big Bang for which there had to be some cause for it to come into existence as it was. Bless you. And that was our very fine technician over here, Thomas Jacoby. Okay, so that was that chapter. And that was a not so difficult chapter, I thought. Mm-hmm. Then chapter 2, does fine tuning for life point to intelligence? And this again is mainly physics, and it has to do with the various constants in nature, the various parameters, he calls them, for all sorts of things like mass of an electron and the force, the strong nuclear force, and these things. And what he's showing in that chapter, the second chapter, is that these constants could have been different. There's a wide range of values they could have had. The value they do have is in a very, very small section of the spectrum it could be. Infinite, almost infinitesimally small. And that you have multiple constants, each of which could have been different, and yet falls in this very, very narrow band. So that the probabilities of all those things, even one of them happening, are beyond calculation, really. Well, you could calculate, I suppose, but you get the number of zeros that will cover the whole universe, right? So we're almost finished this second chapter. I want to go back to page 56 briefly, because he, at the top of the page there, he's going to give the 5 different avenues of approach he's going to take towards this fine-tuning. One is the meaning and significance, which I just discussed. It's so small of a possibility, you know. Number 2, 5 examples. Then, what are the different scientific attempts to explain this without transcendence? Number 3, inflation, string theory, or cyclic cosmology. Inflation, we know, is the theory or hypothesis that at the beginning of the Big Bang there was a sudden acceleration and then a gradual acceleration, and that inflationary period would help to explain the fine-tuning. The second, string theory, is a very speculative theory about 11 or 10 dimensional space, whatever that is. And the third is cyclic, meaning not just the Big Bang, but the big bounce, you know, up and back. And he looks at all 3 of those and shows that it's more difficult to explain fine-tuning with those than it is without them. So those aren't very good theories. The fourth can a multiverse explain fine-tuning? That is, there's just infinite or even finite, but hugely finite universes. We're just in one of them. And he said, that won't do it. So now we're on the fifth part, the need for a transcendent intelligence as ultimate ground of universal fine-tuning. And here we are on page 84. We said, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't have anything until 86.
Well, his very first line in section 5.
Yes.
As noted in section 1, fine-tuning arguments are frequently abductive. And remember, we had to define for ourselves abductive, a logical inference that seeks the most likely conclusion from a set of observations.
So basically, this happened. What must be true for it to have happened?
Or at least
what are the possible explanations of it?
Right. And so it's interesting that, to me, it was interesting right away that the reasoning that we're using with his guidance to draw certain conclusions is also the reasoning that is being used by some of the people putting forward theories of explanation about the universe. So I thought that was interesting.
That's a good point, because basically saying, here's what we observe, here's something we know is real. Now, what are the possible explanations? And he takes the scientific explanation, all the ones they've gotten that have any merit to them, and he eliminates them one by one.
Yes.
What's left is the beyond, I won't call it non-scientific, I'll call it trans-scientific explanation.
Right.
Okay. Joseph, anything?
Nothing before 86.
So now there is a final attempt, and Max Tegmark seems to be the representative here. Second full paragraph on page 86. He conjectured, and believe me, it's a conjecture, that the way out of the inadequacies of merely physical multiverses, both finite and infinite, is to make recourse to ideas. He reasoned that the above improbabilities of fine-tuning could be resolved with a multiverse composed not of bubble universes, but of all coherent mathematical and physical laws, a level 4 multiverse. This is absurd, because you can't have a law or a concept or an idea unless there's a mind in which that idea is existent. And what he says, he's quote from him now, on the page here, mathematical things actually exist, and they're actually physical reality. It's, again, absurd. Stephen Hawking once asked it this way: what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes the universe for them to describe? If I am right, which he's not, and the cosmos is just mathematics, then no fire breathing is required. The mathematical structure doesn't describe universe, it is universe. No, it's exactly the opposite. If I say 2 plus 2 is 4, hey, I loaned you $4, you only gave me back 2. Well, 4 minus 2 is 2, right? Well, yeah, but wait a minute. I want my $2 back. Your idea of 2 doesn't help.
I read some time ago a book that, like this one, was probably over my head, but nevertheless,
Too short.
True.
In my head too.
Yeah. So that explained the Platonic and Aristotelian differences about numbers, and how this often causes confusion because, like you just said, for there to be a number 2, there have to be 2 things. In other words, he's got it backwards, that the mathematical structure doesn't describe a universe. It is the universe, and it's actually the opposite. No, there's a universe, and a mathematical structure is used to describe it. So the mathematical structure, whatever that is an abstraction from what is.
That's perfect.
2. This is 2 things, and now I can write a number 2, but the 2 has to refer back to something. So, but then Plato with his ideals with a capital I, as if these things like the idea of a chair, that somehow the idea of the chair exists before there's a chair, or it exists in some realm of transcendental ideals and truths, and that this among the ancients, this kind of spilled over into understandings of numbers and what they relate to. Like, is there just an idea of two that precedes two things? So anyway, and then reading along in this book that was over my head, so if I am getting it wrong, someone correct me. Aristotle came along and sort of channeled Platonic thinking back along observable concrete reality from which we make abstractions. Okay, so when I saw that, it was kind of one of those aha moments, like when you get sometimes into conversations with people who are in abstractions all the time, you kind of have to bring them back down to earth. And that's kind of what's happening with these cosmologists or astrophysicists or whatever they are.
Yeah, my understanding, and again, correct me because this is also over my head, is that basically when Aristotle says we have to go through the physics in order to come to metaphysics, so we do have to have something physical to comprehend before we can get to metaphysical concepts. But that doesn't necessarily contradict Plato, because the metaphysical concepts we're arriving at are the ideas and the forms that Plato say exist first. In other words, that reality exists in the mind of God, and we see physical things, and through these physical things come closer to the mind of God. So I don't think Plato and Aristotle in this sense contradict each other, but I think what Aristotle's doing, I think you're right, Vivian, is get grounding us again that this might be great, but the only way we can have any access to those forms is actually through physics.
Well, and if there are forms, and we know that there are, like you said, the key thing, they have to exist in a mind.
Yes.
Right.
Well, the whole idea of trying to get by the nonsense of physical fine tuning being a realistic answer is a recourse to ideas. Well, how can there be an idea unless there's a mind to have it? I mean, it doesn't solve any problems whatsoever.
Correct.
So yes, and I think those are good. I think accurate summaries of Plato and Aristotle. Just a little bit of a riff on that, we can say. The idea of two is no more perfect than two in the pencils. You actually got only two pencils there, and they're no more and no less than two. But you take a circle. You can have an idea of a circle which is perfect. That is exactly pi times r, to r squared to get the radius, or 2 pi r to get the diameter. To get the circumference. And so Plato, well, wait a minute. Where do I get my idea of a perfect circle? Because there is no perfect circle in my experience.
Oh.
All my circles here are imperfect, no matter how carefully I draw them. So there must be somewhere some perfect circle.
Mm.
And of course, Plato was right. Because Plato said the idea of the chair exists before the chair. Plato was right. It does. In the mind of God, the idea exists before the chair. In our minds, the chair exists first, and we abstract the idea, and that's how we unite our mind with the mind of God, actually.
Yes.
It's a form of prayer, if you think about it.
I think there's a wonderful ironic, possibly a sense of God's sense of humor in the fact that even mathematically we can't make the perfect circle because we haven't worked out what pi is. Because there's so many. In other words, that we haven't found a recurring decimal for pi, so we still don't know the exact pi. Pi is
3.14159. And Euler, who was perhaps the greatest mathematician of all time, actually in his head, before computers, calculators, he calculated out to, I don't know, like 20 or 30 decimals. But there still is this big race to try and come to a conclusion, And so the last I looked, which is a few years back, they had already extrapolated out to 4 billion decimals.
Wow.
So the difference between that and the next decimal of accuracy would be like the width of a hair compared to the whole universe. that's how much more accurate you get. But I said, you say it's God's humor, right? I said, try and figure it out. I know the answer.
Because I mean, I always think of Chesterton at the end of Orthodoxy, where he says that the one thing that Jesus did not disclose when he was on earth was his mirth, and I think one of Chesterton's poems, it might be the skeleton, the secret laughter on the face of God, and maybe it was the fish. But the point is, the fact is that even mathematically we can't make a perfect circle because we don't know we still don't know what pi
Well,
is.
you can define a perfect circle mathematically, but you can't get the number pi to perfection.
Well, that means we can't define pi in an absolute sense.
No, but that a circle is a line in which every point is the same distance from the center. That's a perfect circle. You don't have to know what pi is to know the circle is perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
But the properties of the circle, of the perfect circle, are such that there has to be some number, you would think. Well, there is, but it never stops so far as we know.
That does seem like God's little joke. And there's lots of these, right? There's just lots of these, a platypus. Good luck categorizing that.
You and I were telling a joke, try to remain po-faced. Goblin is telling a joke, remains pie-faced.
Oh.
Well, just two other quickly areas, because mystery is really everywhere, even in nature. But I think we want to mention already that the physicists are studying matter and energy. That's what they study, right? And they're convertible. We know that. But they have come to the conclusion that what they know of matter and energy, observable, experimentally verifiable, is only 5% of the universe. 25% of the matter we believe it's there, or conclude it's there. We don't know what it is, how to find it. And 70% of the energy, we don't know what it is, how to find it. So even there, God is smiling, if not smirking. Well, here's the second one, which I find really fascinating. Well, they're all fascinating, but we've come further and further in science to see that an atom has electrons circling around a nucleus of protons and neutrons. But it turns out they're not little bodies, little tiny point-like bodies circling around there. They're not anywhere until you look at them, and then you'll find it. But they're probabilities. What does that mean? It's a real mystery. There's no such thing as the position of an electron in its orbit until you measure. Once you measure, it's there. Before you measure, you don't know where it is. It could be anywhere. By the way, another little side note. You may have seen the expression in time, tunneling microscopes, quantum tunneling microscopes.
No.
Because in a core of an atom, the nucleus there, and with the electrons there, they have a probability of being anywhere in the universe, actually, but the probabilities are very, very high in what we call the orbit. And they get less and less and less as you go away from the orbit. But what it means is that you can have something which is, let's say, impervious to electrons, and every so often you'll get one of these electrons over here out of nowhere because it was just a probability. And its probability was very small, but you measured it, and there it was. So it tunneled because it got through the barrier. I mean,
on this topic, we were just recently with a cousin of my husband who's in aerospace. He makes the mirrors that go up onto satellites and telescopes, all these things. And he said, and he's a Christian believer, and he was in Switzerland at that accelerator, one of those accelerators. Yes, CERN. That's exactly where he was. And he said, what are all these scientists talking about these days? They're talking about God. And so, yes. And so, so basically what Spitzer's thesis, science at the doorstep to God, there are literally lots of scientists at the doorstep to God, because the more they've studied these things and the more fantastical reality actually becomes, the more they are considering things that not too long ago you would have been mocked and ridiculed in those circles if you had talked of, transcendence.
Yeah, and Father, correct me if I misunderstood you, but when
You
one
don't
of
have
our
to say that. You don't have to keep saying that. I always will. And I believe in golden rule. That means you may do the same.
Okay, well, that's good.
If I ever
Well,
make a mistake.
if I recall correctly, in one of our conversations outside the pub in Ave Maria, when we were talking about quantum physics.
Well, you say outside the pub, so we're actually at the pub on the outside veranda.
Yes, we were imbibing and eating at the pub and sitting just outside. Yes,
Yeah.
and because you can in Florida, even in January, which is one of the good things about it. But we're talking about quantum physics, and I think that you said that you can measure in terms of quarks. I don't really understand it. In terms of quarks, two particles, let's say a million miles apart, that are responding to each other simultaneously. In other words, this
That's
is something
right.
which also transcends the speed of light. So, the idea of physics always there's an absolute maximum. I mean, E equals mc squared is based upon the fact that the speed of light is the maximum that anything can move. And then, if I remember correctly, you're saying that quantum physics shows that two things can respond to each other literally simultaneously. So, beyond the speed of light.
That's exactly right. And information cannot be transferred faster than the speed of light. So if you create two photons which are entangled, one has spin up and one has spin down, which really has to do with magnetism, not spin. But and they're going in opposite directions. They're related, and they're both probability of being up and down. They're up and down until measured. It's only when you measure it that it becomes up or down. And even Einstein fought this for years and years and years. He said, I cannot believe in spookenhafte Fernwirkung, ghost-like action at a distance. But they've determined, and all science will accept this now, we'll get that far along in science, that it's not as if this is up, but we don't know it until we measure it. No, it's up and down, and when you measure it, it becomes one or the other randomly, okay? But the point is, as you said, Joseph, if they're going apart from each other, 1,000,000 miles apart, and you measure this one will be the other way. Well, that cannot be the case physically, because you can't have physical transmission of information faster than the speed of light. Ergo, I say, all that's happening is in the mind of God, and He is the connection. He's the connector between even quantum particles.
Wow.
You have a little look on your.
No, it's a look of, kind of
wonder.
A wonder and puzzlement, and and so back to Father Spitzer here, where he comes to the conclusion of this guy's attempt to make mathematics a physical reality rather than an expression of reality. And he says that this is
you are
on page 87 at the last paragraph at the top. Trying to combine two contradictories is a category error that invalidates any theory on which such a category error is based. So what I do like about Father Spitzer, though, is that he does give all these people their due. He does explain what their reasoning is, what their theories are. He's obviously smart enough to do that. But then he finds, but this is a logical contradiction and therefore can't be true. And then he moves on to the next guy and does the same thing, That's, and one by one, taking away the props, if you will, that allow even the smartest of men to avoid coming to terms with the reality that there really is a transcendent, intelligent being.
And he's very deferential about it. On page 88.
He is deferential.
At about, quarter way down the page. So thus a level 4 unit multiverse, that is that it's only ideas, is unlikely to be the ultimate explanation. Well, no, it's not unlikely. It's impossible to be, for fine-tuning, because the existence of such a multiverse, which is fundamentally mathematical, requires a transphysical, transuniversal, and transmultiversal conscious intelligence through which the interrelationship of all this formal universal mathematical systems can exist, which is to say, an idea needs a mind, as you said, Joseph.
Yep.
Okay. I just want to comment on page 89. There's a long quote from Lonergan, and I find that typically Lonergan. I mean, I could never understand that fellow. I admire Father Spitzer that he can.
So we'll just skip over that part.
Well, so that concludes this chapter, the second chapter here.
Well, I love the fact that he ends the chapter with saying, okay, we've reasoned our way to the rationality of belief in this transcendent being. But I love the fact that he says, but is it the one intelligent creator taught by all Abrahamic religions? In other words, it's one thing to get to this doorstep of, the likelihood that there is a transcendent intelligent being. It's another step now to put one's faith in a particular religion or revelation or something. And so,
it's one thing to be a transphysical, transuniversal, transmultiversal conscious intelligence. Another thing to be God, It reminds me of a very important passage in Scriptures, Exodus 3:14, where Moses says, well, if I'm going to go, who do I say sent me, And God says, I am,
being.
But then he says, I am the father of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So on the one hand, this very abstract thing on being itself, but I'm the father of Abe and Isaac and Jacob, So
yes.
Likewise here, on the one hand, we have the conclusion there must be some trans-physical, trans blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, it's got a name. It's called Yahweh, God.
I think it's a legitimate question. Basically, that physics, the physical sciences will lead us inexorably to a belief in a transcendent being that brings everything else into being. But then that doesn't answer the question, would that being care less about us? I mean, that's a different question. So this doesn't answer the fact that about the Christian God specifically. It merely answers the fact that we live in a monotheistic cosmos.
Yeah. I think we're at a good point to terminate this session. We'll be back with you next session. Thank you, and God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.